Welcome back to another episode of Buying Sandlot. I'm Kyle Pagan along with Kyle Scott. We have a lot of news to get into today. Like Sports ETA releases a tourism report that highlights a new market number for the industry. Perfect Game is leaning even more into the international market with their new hire. And we get into some legislative news around trends we've talked about before. But before we get into that, we want to talk to you about the premium community we're launching next week. Take it away, Kyle.
Yeah, technically already launched. We have close to 100 people in our as our premium members, and to date, that has largely included some of our deep dive pieces that are not available for everybody. Though candidly, we launched this last summer. We were a lot smaller, and then shortly thereafter, we decided to really focus on the event. So, candidly, we haven't been serving those people as well as I would have liked, right? So for our existing premium members and what I imagine will be an influx of a lot more, we're really doubling down on the premium community aspect of what we have. So that will include, we're rolling out a new platform next week that will allow people, very much like our event app, to see and network with other people in the premium community, connect with them, send them messages, more of like a private, safe space, compared to LinkedIn. We'll also continue to have deep dives, more deep dives that will be available only to premium members. All of the event panels and videos are only premium members or event attendees. And then a big one is data, right? There is and we're going to talk a little bit about this in a second, but there is in my view, huge lack of actionable data in the space. And for a market that's $60 to $80 billion, which we'll talk about in a sec, we're aiming to solve that, at least on the commercial side. So that'll be a big push for us Q2 and Q3 of this year. And most of that will be available exclusively for our premium members. So stay tuned for our premium community. It's our next focus. And then we're also having discussions about smaller one-off events. But my short-term goal here is to take all the energy and conversations we had at the summit and extend that digitally throughout the year as part of the premium community. So look for that to roll out hopefully next week.
Yeah, and if you're still kind of on the fence about, and if you're still sitting on the fence and you didn't get to attend the panels or whatnot, we are putting out clips on our social media from the panels and everything to kind of give you a grasp of what we talked about. But I mean, it might be 10% of what you can find on our premium community, and I've already started listening. I've done 2 to 3 already. I put them on yesterday. Great insight. I love it. Big tournament economics, and U Sports goes to Washington.
Bangers, total bangers. So I usually don't love listening back to our stuff. I'll do it just to kind of see where we can get better. But I'm like, well, I was part of the conversation. Let me put on a podcast by somebody who isn't me and you, right? And here's something new. I have found myself this week back and forth to school in the car, opting for our panel sessions over other podcasts that I typically listen to. And at first it was just to see, hey, how did these turn out? How's the audio? And then I was like, these are so good. And I was a part or in the room for a good chunk of them, not all of them. So some of that is new news, right? Other parts of it are just reliving it, but like, there is not a better database of, 16, 18 conversations of the most important people in youth sports than our Summit dedicated private podcast feed. It's amazing. It's amazing. Where I'm already thinking about how can we take these transcripts and make it actionable for our premium members, because you have the most important people talking about the most important things. So good, like genuinely good listening. Well worth it. Well worth it. I'm walking the walk here. I had big tournament economics on this morning. Total great. Banger. I went from Justin Bieber to BTE.
There you go.
Big tournament.
There you go. You're putting it together. I like. There you go. You're putting it together. I like that. Right on the fly there. Speaking of putting something together, man, the Sports ETA, a Sports Events and Tourism Trade Association, they just released a new report. Published about the sports tourism industry. A lot in there. Obviously, the $275 billion in economic impact the sports tourism as a whole the industry generates. But we want to lock in on the participatory sports tourism, amateur and youth, which accounted for about $150 billion of that total, a figure greater, Kyle, than the GDP of about 70% of the world's nations. A little bit of bullet points: 60 billion in direct spending, about 228 million total travelers, over 880,000 jobs supported, and over 11 billion in state and local taxes generated. What a report! And in a report that in the newsletter might have determined a new industry market number when you did some back of the napkin math and a little deep dive that you never published. You admitted to it.
I did, and I chickened out. I chickened out in November. I did this in November. So yeah, a few things. So Sports ETA released this week. This is not, they do this every year, kind of the market trends report on the tourism side of the business. They had their event in Vegas, so it coincided with their event in Vegas, the release, which I'm not sure about last year, but I imagine that's pretty typically the case. So there's a few things in this. You have direct spend and you have economic impact. There are definitely people more qualified than me to describe economic impact, but that's like, hey, it's outside of what people are directly transacting on, and what other opportunities is it creating in the area. And that number, which can be fuzzy and hard to define, is what's used in feasibility studies to get all of these giant megaplexes built across the country for these giant tournament venues, $50 million, 120,000 square feet or thereabouts. It's that economic impact thing that makes the local municipalities willing and interested in investing alongside private companies in these public-private partnerships to get these built, because you can justify it even if the facility alone is break even, better or worse, somewhere in there. But what I really care about in this one is, kind of double clicking into the participatory sports side. So you have two. You have participation, and then you have the attending sports. Attending sports is obviously pro sports and things like that. It also includes collegiate championships. Now, that used to be in the other bucket, but so it's, all the things you would go to as a fan to buy a ticket. But on the participatory side, you obviously have youth, you have adult rec, and you do have collegiate tournaments. Adult and collegiate make up a big portion of this. So Sports ETA says there's $60 billion in direct spending on the participatory sports. So what we want to determine is, wow, that's a huge number, $60 billion a year. Again, the most widely cited youth sports market estimate is that we're in a $40 billion market, which I think, as we're going to discuss here in a sec, we all agree is too low. But let's just say, wow, 60 billion is bigger than 40. How does this work, right? So it's like, okay, well, you got to remember 60 billion, as I said, includes adult rec, not insignificant, collegiate tournaments, also not insignificant. What portion of that 60 billion is youth?
So Kyle, what percentage of that participatory, which is going to trip us up, we got to stop saying participatory, how much does that include on the youth side?
Good question. I thought you'd never ask. So what I did in November is I looked at Project Play's data, and roughly 27% of that data was in the lodging, travel and lodging bucket, which, as best as I can tell, seems to include, and based on the question, seems to include direct transportation costs and obviously like hotel and lodging costs, right? But in addition to those things, people show up places and they spend money on retail, they spend it on restaurants, they spend it on concessions, other things that are outside of that travel and lodging bucket. Sports ETA includes those things because they're concerned about the impact locally on direct spend, not just at the venue and hotels, but other areas around the city. So it's not an apples to apples comparison, but you figure the travel and lodging buckets are probably pretty equal. So 27% of Project Play's $40 billion number comes out to be about $11 billion spent by youth sports parents on travel and lodging. Okay. If you were to take that number and apply it to the travel and lodging line in the Sports ETA report, as of November, it's adjusted slightly with this new report, but it was in the same ballpark. It equates to about 41% of the participatory bucket comes from youth sports, right? I think that's conservative. I've heard people in the industry say youth sports makes up about 65% of sports, participatory sports travel, but only about half of the revenue. So let's figure it's somewhere between 40 and 50%, and let's go with 41 just to be on the most conservative side. If you were then to apply that 41% across other buckets outside of transportation and lodging, like retail, concessions, recreation, other areas that people spend in the city, and you just take 41% of 60 billion, that implies that direct spend related to youth sports travel is around 24.6 billion. Okay. So call it 25 billion just to round it off, right? That means, that travel spending alone makes up 25 billion. That means even the most conservative estimates on the youth sport market, youth sports market like Project Play, which were at 40 billion, you'd have to add $14 billion to their market estimate if you want to include those other things people spend when they're traveling for their kids' sports teams, right? So that means that number is really 54 billion. 2 years ago, Connecticut, another research firm, put out a number that had the market at exactly 54 billion. Again, that was 2 years ago. I mean, inflation, depending on which sector you're in, you're talking 3, 4, 5%, right? You can easily, I say conservatively, add 7 or 8% growth just on 2 years worth of inflation. So that would take the Connecticut number up today. That survey was done 2 years ago, up to close to 60 billion. And then you have Jeremy Goldberg at our event saying, hey, we think it's 80. And someone agreed with him. Matt Mueller's playing off in, in Fantasyland in the $2.7 trillion market. But that's Huddle's market, right? They're not going after just youth sports. They're looking at the global sports market, which he pegged at 2.7 trillion. So not apples to apples there. But you have, people like Jeremy and others who think it's 80. So I think if you look at the sports ETA data, we could safely conclude that just youth sports travel alone might be $25 billion, meaning you're looking at safely a $60 to $80 billion youth sports market today. And some estimates have that projected to double over the next 5 to 7 years. Like, these are big numbers. And I hate the $40 billion number, the project. Everyone cites Project Play. It's a 2-year-old survey. It doesn't account for everything. It's just parent spend. Like, it's missing the mark by maybe 100%.
And I think maybe, I forget if Samir said, I think he quoted around 70 million-ish as well when you talked to him a couple months ago.
That's right. I wish I would have put that in the newsletter. I think he did as well.
That's okay. That's why we have the podcast to expand on the newsletter. That's why we break down this news. Wow, what a number. What's that do for you when you hear that number?
I mean, I think it's again, these are such big numbers. Like, this is one of those industries where I feel like you don't even need the back of the napkin. You just need to look in that direction. You're like, whether it's 40, 60, 80, 100, huge numbers, right? And it's so fragmented. It just reinforces why so many people are moving into the space, especially if it doubles over the next, it's 5 to 7 years. And again, I said this, I've said this before. I was actually on another podcast yesterday and I mentioned this, but my prior thing, we were in B2C sports media covering pro sports teams, and then gambling gets legalized, DraftKings, FanDuel, all this money floods into that space. And it really benefited us as a media company, especially being in a market that was one of the first to kind of legalize online betting, right? So it became a really good media business. Everyone in sports benefited from it. And I remember reading these research studies from Jefferies and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, whatever, 2018, 2019. And I think they said it was in the near term going to become legal sports betting in the US was going to become a $5 to $7 billion market, right? And by 2025, it was going to grow to about 20 billion or thereabouts. I may have talked about this before. And I think I checked last year. I think we're roughly there, maybe a little higher, 20, 25 billion today, and things have kind of slowed. Everyone who's worked in sports or media over the last, or certainly gaming over the last 7 to 8 years acknowledges that the legal sports betting opportunity in the US was massive, unprecedented, one-time switch flip of a market turning on after that Supreme Court decision in 2018. And it's, not only financially, it's changed so many things in sports. You don't need to go far in the news to see and hear about all this stuff. Youth sports today, even if you take Project Play's $40 billion number, is twice as big, right? In reality, it's probably 3 to 4 times as big today, right? So everyone agrees the legal sports betting market in the US is huge. Youth sports is 3 to 4 times larger, and it's going to double potentially, or close enough over the next 5 to 7 years. So, you just jump well up the compounding curve, right? Yeah. You're now compounding, you're doubling from a 40, 50, $60 billion base. It is just such a massive sector within the economy and sports. So these numbers just prove it. And I thought the travel piece has always been undersold in some of these estimates, and the sports ETA data really, kind of hammers home the point that you need to think about the youth sports market beyond beyond just the direct spend on the hotel and the registration for tournaments.
As John Dorsey said it, beyond heads and beds. Love that term. Love that
So,
term.
I mean, perfect day for Event Connect to be sponsoring the newsletter. Unrelated, unintentional. As I was going through, I was like, who's our sponsor today? I'm like, oh, Event Connect. This is perfect. But I literally just talked to them the other day, and they said, hey, we're rolling out this tool, Quantism, where we're trying to corroborate these economic impact numbers, right? So what we just talked about largely was direct spend, but economic impact is usually like 2 to 3x bigger, and that's like what money is getting, what jobs are being created, what ancillary indirect effects are happening on the backs of this direct spend. This is the feasibility study. All these things get built on. Everybody knows this. I get over my head in that area, but it's clear like these are estimates. Sometimes they're more bullish than they probably turn out to be. And most times people just refer to, well, how many room nights, how many heads and beds did that equate to? And what I think Event Connect is trying to do with Quantism, and I don't want to put too many words in their mouth here, but they're really, they're trying to, what did John say? There's still a gap in how those numbers are consistently measured and validated. And they're trying to do that with this new tool, which I find fascinating because I think there's probably some spots where you might find that things are oversold. Other spots you might find things are undersold, but the reality is it's such a big piece of the industry and it needs better data. And I think it's a winning endeavor for them and frankly for the industry. If you can directly say, hey, this was the economic impact of, and this is, why we can continue building these facilities and things like that.
The thing is too, Sports ETA doesn't even fully capture the entire landscape because media multiplies tourism value. And we talked with on the back to the big economics panel, Rob Ponger, 1.1 billion social impressions, 90 million people on PG.TV. Like the media side to it is another add-on to this whole youth sports industry number, and it's untapped. I would think it's in the infancy.
Right, Right, I agree, and I think this is where some of the Project Play data that is built just around parent spend begins to fall apart, because as we've talked about, if you have sponsorship and other affiliate opportunities, we'll talk about that in a second. Actually, let's talk about it now. Nick Carroll, right, from Prep Network on the Big Tournament Economics, right, BTE Banger Pod, right. I was like literally was listening today, then came on LinkedIn. He was talking about the exact point I just heard. So like the algo is just on point on my phone. But what he was saying is like, hey, the cost concern among parents now is real. I mean, they run tournament businesses. He wasn't talking the sort of like charitable line here. He was like, hey, listen, the parents are telling us that like they're having to choose because the costs are getting too high. So he's like, what can we do as an industry, whether it's through sponsorship, whether it's through affiliate and commission kickbacks from hotels and other local things when you put on a tournament that the organizer is able to get, as kind of a commission or an affiliate fee. How can we pass those back to parents to hold steady the cost or lower the cost? Again, we've talked about this like our last 10 shows, nothing new. That's where Project Play's numbers, I think, begin to fall apart because they're based around parent spend, right? So if you have a tournament 5 years from now that is able to hold the cost steady with where it is today, let's just make up a number, $500 a kid, right? And it doesn't grow any, that's just parent spend. But that venue might be generating $1,000, in total per head when layering in sponsorship and other affiliate fees. And that's not really accounted for in a lot of the numbers that people talk about in the space because they're based on that parent spend data from Project Play. So to your point, the sponsorship revenue sometimes goes uncaptured, and it's not even thought about here in the Sports ETA thing because it's not, a direct spend. And I think that becomes a bigger line item over the next 5 to 10 years in these some market estimates.
If sponsorship wasn't the main word, I feel like that was thrown out there at the Buying Sandlot Summit, then I would say consolidation was probably the other one. Does consolidation of this industry, does that raise the number? Does that raise the industry number, do you think?
Well, I think it does, but if anything, it helps the sponsorship number most, right? The potential, because you can now reach, we've talked about this, I think. Pete has talked about it, Samir from Game Changer. I mean, pretty much everyone had like, if you get enough consolidation, now a sponsor doesn't need to go to all of these local clubs or venues or whatever. They can go to a single partner, right? They can go to Capacity Sports Group now that has 5-6 large facilities in their network, if not more. Strike a single partnership deal at a single dollar value and distribute it across all of those facilities. Same thing with Carvana and Rush. So I think it definitely helps the sponsorship piece because you're able to bundle together this stuff. On the digital side, really interesting stuff from Daron Gerstel, the CEO of Pixelot at our event. He comes from a media background, and he talked about demand and supply side. This gets super confusing even for like someone like me who's been in the media for a while. But at the end of the day, the demand is the number of consumers who can view that ad, and the supply side is who can serve it. And he said, even digitally right now, it's been really hard for brands to tap into that supply of youth sports digital eyeballs, streams, registration apps, things like that, because even they're fragmented. And he's saying, who's building like the Google ad network for youth sports where a single brand can buy into youth sports eyeballs and have their logo and their ad appear before streams using Pixelot cameras in the Game Changer app on TeamSnap? I think that's what he was largely driving at. Like, who's creating that centralized network that brands can invest in and distribute across all these youth sports digital platforms, similar to how they do on the internet, right? We're very early days. So yeah, like, I think more consolidation definitely unlocks more sponsorship, and certainly it grows the market. You get efficiencies and more money and all that stuff.
And remember, Steve Sanders said, sponsorships are dead. It's brand partnerships now. You got to find a way to partner. You got to find a way to unlock. You got to find a way to be a part of the local field or the elite sports academy or the elite tournament. It's not just a logo slap. I think Mark said that from Base Sports Group as well. The brands don't want a logo slap anymore. They want to be integrated into the tournament, into the field, into the event there, into the stream and stuff. So interesting.
Yeah, I was going to shout out Mark and Carrie from Base, Dan Scheinman from Priority Partnerships. They talked about this, but that's exactly what it is. And I think Base and Carrie and some of her background in Nielsen, they just raised the $2.5 million. I think a lot of that came on the backs of they weren't just doing sponsorship; they were passing back the data to partners and proving it out. Right? That's also been the missing piece in youth sports. If you just bought an ad on the back of the local club, how many eyeballs? No one knows, right? The pizza shop doesn't know. They're not quantifying that, but Coca-Cola wants to quantify that, and they need to quantify that to spend the money. So, getting that data passed back and some infrastructure around, explaining the ROI to these brands, also important.
Yeah. And the orgs and the club teams and stuff that will win will be the ones that are able to do creative partnerships. I thought Steve Sanders was great with what he said. Maybe we can do rebates and we can get that to a scholarship fund for Aspire athlete or something to come to the academy. So a lot of opportunity in the sponsorship game. I know, like you said, we've talked about it for the last 10 episodes, but it's I think one of the most interesting topics to talk about. And I think one of the most interesting spots right now is, and they said this again on the big tournament economics panel, was the people who are competing for Super Bowls. The people who are lobbying the NFL for Super Bowls are lobbying the perfect game and your big clubs and your big tournaments for these tournaments because they see the economic impact there. That's crazy to think about in terms of youth sports.
Yep. And it only works if you do something to offset, the cost of that, right? Yeah. So those two things go hand in hand. And I would add, and maybe this is a segue here for our next thing, but Sports ETA, there's like 7 bullet points in the report they put out, but one of them is around the opportunity on international sports tourism, certainly around major events like the World Cup and the Olympics, for sure. That's on the fan attending side, but even on the participatory side, well, listen to these numbers. 1.7 million international participatory sports travelers, 2 billion spent international dollars by participatory sports travelers. So again, if you figure youth is half that, you're talking $1 billion in youth sports international tourism. And I think we're just getting started here, right? I'm going to read one of their quotes real quickly. By capitalizing on the immediate influx of international spectators and intentionally converting that momentum into long-term participatory event opportunities, destinations can unlock sustained growth, diversify their sports portfolios, and strengthen their position in the global sports tourism marketplace. So again, do you want to go to Wichita, Kansas, or do you want to go to Portugal for your kid's soccer tournament? Right. Again, there's a cost thing there for sure. I'm not like dismissing that, but in a world of AI, I think IRL in real life events continues to be like a macro trend. And why not? If we're going to travel for sports, let's take an extra few hours on the plane and go somewhere cooler.
Yeah, making a vacation out of it and stuff. I mean, they
Yeah.
do it in Florida. You might as well do it, like you said, in Portugal. But Perfect Game, who's leading, who's one of the leading companies at International Charge, they just hired Cash Sheikh as its CMO and head of international. Sheikh will join PG's executive leadership team and oversee global marketing, brand strategy, creative partnerships, and sponsorships. And he will also lead the international P&L and expansion. Excuse me. He was the co-founder of Baseball United, a pro league focused on the Middle East and South Asia. So he already has, contacts over there. He also served as league chairman and CEO and created the Arab Classic, a tournament featuring teams from countries in the region. Sheikh also has stops at Procter & Gamble and GoPro, and he founded a marketing agency, BSB Sports Group International, and has experience as a leadership speaker. Shout out to Sheikh. I just gave him his entire resume. I just read it out on this podcast. Didn't really mean to do that, but I was just reading off the newsletter. What is this? What is this?
What are his hobbies?
Yeah,
what are his hobbies?
I gotta see what
his kids' names.
I gotta see who endorsed him on LinkedIn. What is this? What does this hire signal to you? I mean, obviously they're expanding over to the Asia Pacific Rim, Australia as well. What's this kind of signify for you from PG?
Yeah, I mean, I think our newsletter today is just jam-packed of trends. And I said this on the last episode. Our show is basically just things happening and saying, oh, yeah, that's a trend we're noticing, right? But one of our predictions for 26 was international expansion. And I think we talked about it more on the tech side. But, maybe we undersold the opportunity around events and tourism like we just talked about, right? PG is probably leading here, right? I mean, the Pacific Rim and youth sports are typically not phrases that go together, right? It makes sense for baseball, right? So I'm just bullish on the general trend here. I have no other take other than I think PG is, they're ambitious, right? Like you listen to Rob talk, you're like, wow, like they're going for it, right? They're going for global baseball brand. They talk about themselves as a platform, not just an events organizer, not just a scouting and recruiting, media company, but like a platform, like a baseball, one-stop everything. So love it. Yeah, it just like points to everything we're talking about here.
Yeah, and James was in the newsletter. This was coming from his take. He'd imagine India will enter the picture sooner rather than later. We did previously write about how its youth sports industry is emerging, and baseball already has some traction there. And it's worth noting that the Sports ETA report also highlighted opportunities around international sports tourism, as we were just talking about. Yeah, shout out to Perfect Game. Ambitious, I think, is the right word. And it's only going to get crazier from here, I would say. I think the international expansion is started and maybe spearheaded by Perfect Game, and the tech companies are right behind it. Game changer with Foot Locker. Aman talked about that on the Tech Heavy Hitters panel about how they're utilizing Game Changer in the Foot Locker acquisition that Dick's made last year.
Yep, no, that was a great point, and I'm glad he made that because way back a couple of months ago, we always do the deep dive into the Dick's earnings when they talk about Game Changer, and we talked a lot about Foot Locker and how that was really just sort of the door for Dick's and Game Changer to go international. And here, Aman, back that up more firmly than I expected. Frankly, he was like, "Yes, our international play is Foot Locker. Like that's the play here."
Yeah.
So, yep, big trend.
Dick's execs did call it, what did they call it? The secret weapon Game Changer that Dick's had. So it'll be interesting how they utilize that. We speaking of trends, let's keep it with some legislative news. In Delaware right now, youth sports leaders are sounding the alarm about the city of Wilmington's new safety policy. All leagues must hire off-duty cops for events. Rule comes after a fatal shooting at youth football game last fall. The mayor, John Carney's office, says budget is too tight to cover the cops. Private company operates, process for city takes a cut, and some city council members are pushing back on the rule. Unfortunately, we saw this in Rhode Island, where we saw a shooting at an ice hockey rink that involved a family. We talked about this. It's important to have emergency action plans. It's important to have security, but it's also tough for these organizations to have that security because at the end of the day, it costs money. So who does that typically fall back on? Falls back on the parents if they don't have legislative to cover it, or so we talked about this, I think, when Cory Booker went on his rant about how expensive youth sports is, and I believe you said the first legislation we're going to see is probably in the safety and compliance industry, a part of youth sports. Was that correct?
Yeah, I'm stealing words from Stephen Weiler, who was on our Youth Sports Goes to Washington panel. Love him, by the way. But that was, he's like, listen, this topic will come up in Washington. And besides cost, one of the easiest things for everybody to rally around is some sort of standards around safety and health and safety, insurance, things like that. And I think if you take that nugget you just relayed about Delaware, and then pair it with this other nugget we had today, Josh Gottheimer, Democrat out of New Jersey, has introduced a bipartisan bill that would require cardiac screenings for high school athletes to prevent sudden cardiac deaths. By the way, great thing. You should do this at age 2. It shouldn't even be high school, because a lot of these are birth defects. Gottheimer has introduced several youth sports related bills in the past. So the point being, cardiac screenings and security guards are somewhat unrelated, but they fall under the bucket of, and I wish our panel, I thought this would be more well attended, but it was a fantastic panel. There were plenty of people in the room still. It was the preparedness and protection panel we had, where we were talking about this stuff. We were talking about insurance. We were talking about compliance. You're talking about physical safety. Huge trend. These venues get bigger and more people show up. It's just complete table stakes. And lots of people are thinking about it. Lots aren't. But I think the security side is maybe even a step behind the athletic trainers, right? Everyone thinks about health and safety, but what about like physical safety? Bad stuff happens in the world, and having off-duty cops and security guards and evacuation plans and all these things, it's the same thing that's happened to schools over the last 10 to 15 years. I think, it's coming for these large venues, and it's just something people are thinking about. It's a cost, but it's also an opportunity for the companies providing it, right? And ultimately, it's a good thing.
And you do see parents, being pro security. There was I think we wrote about a basketball tournament in Nebraska last year, I believe, that officials threatened to boycott unless armed guards were hired. I don't know much about that story, why they needed armed guards, but and then there was another one in Texas where the league had to raise its registration fees 24% to cover security at all events. That's on the back end, where it's like, unfortunately, those costs are coming onto parents. I feel like if you want event safety, I think that one's a bigger sell to parents than, this team registration platform is going up 24% just because. Like, I think player safety, a lot of parents would agree that, okay, I will spend the extra dollars to make sure that me and my family are safe at a sporting event, because unfortunately, bad things do happen in the world.
And I think consolidation helps this too, right? You have better standards. Those costs can be those expense items can be spread out for these bigger venues, whether it's insurance or compliance. Maybe not the man hours for security guards, but a lot of this stuff could be absorbed by larger organizations versus an individual rec league having to figure this all out on their own. So I think consolidation ultimately helps there. It's one of those stories where consolidation, yes, it could drive costs up because there's less competition, but at the same time, it can absorb costs more easily, and again, provide better, safe, fun experiences, which ultimately matters. And again, like old time, everyone wants it to things the way they used to be, but everything was so diffuse, didn't make sense to have a security guard at like a single T-ball game, right? But if you got 3,000 people moving through a venue in a day or something, you kind of need security. We went through this with our event, right? First time I had to hire a security guard. By the way, I'm going to stump. We had a security guard at the event. You probably didn't even notice him, because I was expecting one of those bright yellow jackets that you see at sports arenas.
Little ear thing coming from the ear down to the shirt. I was expecting.
I don't know if he had an ear thing, but he had a nice suit. Yeah. Oh, did he?
He didn't have it. No, he didn't have an ear thing. He didn't have an ear thing. He didn't look. He didn't look like Secret Service. But you're right. That was a nice suit.
He had a lapel pin, though. He did. He had like a Secret Service looking pin on the lapel, because I saw the guy. I'm like, who is this guy? And then I was like, oh, he's our guy. He's like undercover, but that pin. I think every security guard at a youth sports venue should be dressed to the nines with like a little Secret Service like pin, just to add to the mystique.
I don't know if he meant to, but he blended in perfectly with the suit.
So it was great.
Shout to him.
It was great. He really blended. It was just a pin. I noticed the pin, and the fact that he stood at the door at Ballers all night.
Yes, that's true. That's true. The best security is the one you don't even know that's there. I'll tell you that.
Yes. Yes.
This definitely will not be the last time we talk about this story in Delaware. I would not be shocked if we get another related news item, because one operator said it will cost an extra $30,000 to hire the cops that the mayor of Delaware, or Wilmington, excuse me, wants to institute, and then an expense his league may not be able to afford, he said. And then other critics say the policy is an overreaction to an isolated incident. So we'll follow this.
Microcosm event, by the way, right? Mayor of is Wilmington, right?
Yep.
Mayor of Wilmington, not that big, impacts a few people in Delaware. Congress of the United States does something similar. Now it impacts everybody, right? That's the it's a canary in the coal mine, as they say.
Yep. Anything else before we get out of here?
No, this was a busy week. This was a busy week in youth sports. Like, just a lot happening.
Yeah. 3 solid newsletters packed with information. So much information that I think, have some great interviews next week that we have to now push off. So more's coming.
Yeah, so jam packed. Again, I don't want to pat ourselves on the back.
Yourself on the back.
I read through these last couple, and I was like, man, these are good. Not only there's a lot happening in the space, right? But we've been doing this, relatively long enough now, where as things are happening, right, we have data or interviews you did, like Xbox Go in January, that as things happen, we have prior interviews, data, videos where we've talked about these things, dove deep into these things, and can add meaningful context. And that's the sort of thing that just only comes with like repetition. So there was a lot going on in youth sports this week. And I think, especially our last couple of newsletters, just like tour de force. Nobody else is doing this.
No, Eric from Event Connect. I mean, I got to shout it out one more time. Big tournament economics panel. Eric said, when we started this, I think when we had a couple hundred subscribers, he was like, people have just been craving this kind of youth sports business content and stuff. And that's why he reached out to you initially and stuff. So great testimonials, a lot of great testimonials from the Buying Sandlot Summit. We appreciate all of you people who have given us testimonials on LinkedIn. I'll set it up for you again. Anything before we head out?
No. And not to, I don't want to pat ourselves into it. There's a lot of good, there was a lot of news this week, like a lot of interesting news. This report today, I forget what Wednesday, but I remember Wednesday being like, man, we got to cut stuff from the newsletter. So just a lot happening.
Yeah.
I think it's going to just keep going fast now, right? It's like we've reached escape velocity in the industry. Last thing to plug would say, like, everything we talk about here, everything that's in the newsletter, our next focus is the premium community. And, we get so many emails of like, hey, put me in touch with this person. I read this. Do you know this? Like, that doesn't scale, right? The ability to kind of make introductions, or someone's looking for investment and pairing them together, like, that doesn't scale. So what we're really, that's why you do an event, but we're trying to extend that event throughout the course of the year. And I think our premium community is really going to come to be the place where not only do we have these discussions, but then the community is able to talk about the things we're talking about, network with each other, and then get a little bit more of our own proprietary data that we aim to put out, right? That will, be for community members only. So that's our focus. Keep an eye out for it next week. And definitely do consider it, right? I don't take it lightly that it does cost money, right? I think we got a price of $59 a month, $500 a year. But frankly, some of the things I've seen happen, both through introductions we've made and just some feedback I've heard from the event, you're talking like tens of millions of dollars in investments have been made based on connections that we've facilitated. So just from that angle alone, it's worth it for a lot of people. And I think the data aspect will be actionable data for everyone in the industry, right? What are your peers doing that works, that doesn't work? We're going to aggregate that data, make it available to you so you can learn from this highly fragmented industry, what works, what doesn't, and put some numbers behind it.
I love it. Hey, everybody have a great weekend. GG's.
GG.